Here's a buck that I needed to make to help sort out the shape and the form of a part. And I'm going to take you through the steps that I used to build it. I have this sheet metal angle that I made into a sweep. I shrank and stretched the edges in order to represent a part, but it can flex, so I don't want to build the part off of it. We're going to build a buck. The first thing I did is decided I want to make this in two pieces. The first piece will be here with most of the shape in it, and the rear section just has a number 15 sweep arc in it. I took the sheet metal form and I laid it over here and I traced it out. And that's how I got the base dimension that I needed, a 12-inch wide piece for my base. And then that also gives me the height that I need for my second part. So I'm going to get ready. I'm going to cut the base out. With the base, I have the line where I needed to cut, but I've also made an offset. So let me show you how I come up with that offset. My skill saw from the edge of the base plate over to the edge of the blade is roughly 1 3/8. It's right there, maybe just a little heavier than 1 3/8. And my kerf is just under 1/8 inch. So what I did, I took the kerf plus that dimension, ended up with 1.5 inches, and that's what I've set my offset for my straight edge. That way I can get a nice straight cut. So I'm going to cut this real quick and we'll get ready to lay out everything else. So I've come in with the saw and I've just kissed it, and you can see I'm right at the edge of that pencil mark. So I'm happy with that. We're going to move on. I'll cut the piece out. Here we are. I've come in and just touched the edge of the part, and you can see I'm right on the edge of my pencil line. I'm happy with that. So I'm going to continue to cut the part out. So the next thing I had to take into consideration is I have the width right for the base panel, but the front of the hood has an arc to it. So I have to set a center line up, I set a center line on the hood, I set them together, and then I set the same dimension here and here. That's going to allow me to have the front arc for the hood. Now I can take this dimension and go back my 12 inches, which is what I came up with on this, because this is using the edge, it's using the edge of the sheet metal form. So it didn't compensate for the arc. So now I know that I have the 1.1 inches, which is the peak of the arc, set, and I can come back that 12-inch dimension and we'll have the base plate ready to cut. So I know at the edges, from the top of my base plate to the top of the part, I need 6 9/16 inch. So at the edge, I put 6 9/16 inch, and I ran a straight edge all the way across it. But the center of the part is going to be up on top of a peak, which is a number 15 sweep. So what I did is came over here and I laid out a number 15 sweep, and at 40 inches I measured down to find out what my offset needed to be. My offset needed to be 11/16 up at the peak. So I came up my 11/16, used my number 15 sweep. I set it into the center and measured both edges to make sure that I was in the proper alignment, parallel. Drew it and then just continued to trace that number 15 sweep down both sides. So now this part will be our backbone. So here's our base plate, and what this is going to do is it's going to sit up off of this edge and create the backbone for our part. Just like that. And it's going to be the foundation for the rest of the sweep, the rest of the station buck. So I don't know if you could see it, but this jigsaw blade has teeth kind of in both sides, going in both directions. I'm using a down cut because I want the top where I can see the line to stay nice and clean. An up cut might break off some of the fibers and mess my cut up. There's no shortcut here. It's just taking your time and getting the line cut. We're going to cut nice and accurate and then sand too. This is right after I just got done cutting it. I took my sweep. I just took and kind of rubbed it on there. And it's going to show me all my little highs. So now I'll come through, I'll give it a little bit of a sanding and try to clean it up a little bit. There's a couple little spots that I just got to get a little bit closer. Got a couple little spots that are a little heavier, so I broke out the belt sander. I had done some off camera and got it pretty close. That's a lot better. Still maybe a little right here. It's good through there. Just a little bit right there. All right, I think that's good enough. So now we can get ready to join the base with the back spine piece. Here's our face piece. We're going to take and use the jigsaw to cut that arc and get this piece ready to join to the back spine. Struck a line 3/8 of an inch in, half of our material thickness. Came in an inch and marked every 6 inches down the panel, inch on both sides, 6 inches down the panel to the center. Now the screws that I'm using are made for MDF. Here they are. I am going to pre-drill. That way, when the boards come together, if the threads are still into the base piece, it may push a little bit, and then before it wants to free spin and pull the parts together. But if I pre-drill, it's going to allow it to pull the parts together more easily. I'm also going to use a bit of tight bond and glue my joints. I'm not going to worry about the little bit of overglue. I'm just going to wipe it off with a rag. I'm not going to use a damp rag like you normally would for cabinets or anything. These screws do a great job for holding without splitting or blowing out the ends. So there we are. And now we have a nice, tight, secure joint. When the wood glue sets up, it'll be permanent. In order to get the next dimension for our side piece, which is going to square up the backbone and the base, I need to know how much I need to add to it for this bit of arc here. So I've laid out 3/4 of an inch. I'm going to take my square. I don't know if you can see it, but it's going to add just over 1/8 of an inch. At that 3/4 mark, it's going to add just heavy of 1/8 of an inch to that part. So what we'll do is we'll add 1/8 of an inch here. We'll lay out and we'll add whatever we need here for this upper arc. And then we could cut out our side pieces based off of our sheet metal pattern. So I've laid out my top to bottom with that additional for the arc, and then my additional for my straight edge. And then I simply took my sheet metal part, I've come up and put a rough line where I need to cut. At that line, I'll cut this one, and then I'll match it on the other one and then sand them at the same time to make sure it all works out. So I'll cut this with the jigsaw first, then I'll cut the straight edge with the skill saw, separate the two parts, match draw it, and then cut the other part and sand them at the same time.
Leave me Seymour, I'm dying over here.
That is very close. There's going to be a little bit more sanding once we get it on the buck. So I'm going to leave it at that. Before we put these on, what I did is I compared it to my metal sweep. This station right here is a number 25 sweep. It's a known sweep. So what I've done is I've marked the edges of where it is on the sweep, and I came in and I used a center finding square, and I just come in and I've made a mark on that arc. And I measured back and say 4.5 inches is enough to where I'll clear the bottom and I can get a nice piece in there. Plenty of room to put screws. But I need to know how much rise that number 25 sweep has. So what I've done is I've drawn a center line on my panel. And then I measured up on each end to make sure I was even across it. That's what squared up my arc. I drew it, traced it along to each edge, and then I measured and I drew a horizontal line in between the two. I made sure that both of them were even. I measured up, I had 1.25 inches. So I need 5 3/4, which is this mark, in order to make the arc and have 4.5 on each side. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to measure up on each side. It's fairly even there. And I should be able to trace my arc and end up at my 4.5 inch line. So now I can cut this center line out and be good to go. We'll have our center station. I will need to remove 3/4 of an inch from each side so it fits in between our two end caps. But this will give us the centerpiece to go in between the two end caps. So now I can take this long piece, clean it up and sand it, and I'm going to use that as an arc all the way across my part, like a sweep, to confirm that my shape is right. Same thing, we'll compare it to the sweep and we'll sand it as needed. So once again, we pre-drilled, got everything ready. The glue acts like a little bit of a lubricant to the joint. So we'll get this bottom corner, we'll start our screws right into the corner. By pre-drilling, it's going to help eliminate that little bit of push that the screws are going to give you, wanting to push the parts away from each other. MDF doesn't like a lot of torque, so we're just going to get them together and call it good. The glue is going to hold it once everything's had time to set up. That little bit of squeeze out is perfect. There we are. Now I'll do the same thing to the other side. And once I have the other side on, I'm going to lay out identical marks on both sides for our mid panel. Before I set the metal form on here and mark this line, I do want to trim this on that little bit of an angle that it needs because of the arc. So all I did is take my pencil and I started right there because this is the heavier side. And as I came up with the pencil, I slowly just kind of picked up the pencil as I thought it needed to be in order to get it up to this one. And I'll just come in with my little sander. I'll use this sander. I'll come in and I'll sand it down and get it close before I set the other part on here. It might be hard to see, but I'm taking the sander at an angle and I'm just blending it until it just touches this inside, because this inside should be very close. And most of the material has to come on the outside, so I'm just taking it at a little bit of an angle and blending it together. Now that I have it close, I'll come in with the other small jitterbug sander, and I'll give it another sanding with like 80 grit. Now once we put this piece in, it may still need a little bit more adjustment, but this will allow us to lay that metal form on and get everything a little better dialed in. So it might be kind of hard to see, but I need a little bit of correction. A little bit of correction in the shape. So what I've done is I've gone and marked the inside, and I'll just sand it too. But other than that, it's not bad. I put a mark right where that bottom of that number 25 sweep needs to go, and we should be able to put our sanded correctly and then put our midpoint in. So I've taken both sides and I've got them very accurate to our steel part. And what I did is I came in here and I made a measurement where that number 25 sweep goes. Made sure the mark was on the same spot on both sides. And then I made that angular mark down, square from it. So now we can trim our number 25 sweep piece that we cut to be that middle board, and we can get it fit in. So you can see now I've rested that middle board in there. It's not screwed on. See, it needs a little bit of adjustment here for the amount of slope that this has. You can see the difference between the front arc and that number 25 sweep, how much it's going to change. Now, I didn't screw this in here. We want to get the angle so that we can cut a couple of little ribs to go inside of there. And we're going to put a couple in here too to make it more rigid and to give us more points of definition. So once we have that angle figured out, we'll figure out the size of the parts we need, get them cut out, and we'll rough them in. So there's the line I made with the circle center finder. I came in with my angle finder and got right on it. Ended up with right around 48 degrees. So I set my miter box up at 48 degrees, and I cut a little test piece. Our test piece works out to be fairly accurate. I think that's well within the margin of error. So now we can set our number 25 sweep back in here, and we can measure in the different places that we want to have support, and we can get the heights for those supports marked out, and we cut the back sides at that 48-degree slope. So I originally thought that I would put 3 in, but when I put 3 in, they looked a little bit far apart. So then what I decided to do is maybe I should put 4. So I took the 38.5, which is what I have inside to inside across the buck, and divided by 5. That gave me 7.7 inches from edge to center. So that's what I did, and that's going to be a little closer together, and I think it's going to work out a little bit better. But since I wanted 4 pieces, I needed to divide by 5 because I have 5 spaces. When you do the division, it ends up being the gaps that you need. So you would take the number of stations you wanted plus 1, divide it by the distance. I hope that makes sense. So I want 4 stations. I would divide the length by 5, which gives me 7.7 inches apart. And I think that'll be a lot easier to make the paper pattern off of and a little bit of everything. So I'll make the top the same way. So I've come back in and I've set our center board back in. And now I can measure up at those 7.7 inch positions. And I know that this station needs to be at least 4.5 inches tall. And that'll give me enough, once I cut that slope on it, that'll give me enough to shape in that edge. So I can come into the next station, and this one can be 4 3/4. Go back through and just double check as I go. So 4.5 and 4 3/4 are the heights that I need in order to put these stations in. 4.5 here, 4 3/4 here, and that'll make them tall enough. And then I can measure from the back side to the front, and I can know how deep to make them. And then we can shape the edges afterward. So I took the little test wedge and set in there. Then I can go in and measure to the back side of it. And I know how long I need to make my parts. So as long as I make my parts 8 1/4, there will be enough to stick out over the edge and give us enough to shape. So now I have my 2 measurements that I need. I can cut all of these, cut the back slope on it, and then we can shape the fronts. So I decided to change this angle on the these boards here to 40 degrees, just to make it a more even number, and my part fit it a little bit better, so I don't have to do any sanding on the 25 sweep board. So I clamped 2 of the blanks in place on each end. That allowed me to mark where the 25 sweep board goes, and I could pre-drill it from the inside out. So now I'll glue and put that board in, and I can use those as fixtures to hold it in place. So I've put in, screwed and glued our number 25 sweep board. And what I've done is I came in and made just slight adjustments to these stations in order to get them more even across the board. Once I did that, I set square lines all the way back. I set square lines for where I'm going to pre-drill for some screws. And now what I've done is on the high side of this arc and the high side of this arc, I made a mark at the top and the bottom. And then this edge is fairly consistent all the way down. So I just came in and I traced that edge. Did that to both of these 2 stations. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut these 2 stations and use them as patterns to cut these 2 stations. The way everything stays consistent, and I'll sand them in sets of 2. Once they're on, I can screw them down, glue them, and then I can final sand them to blend the 2 arcs together. So let me get set up to do that. They don't look bad. That one I might have sanded a little bit heavy, and this one maybe a little heavy, but it's all right. There's a little bit of left to right inconsistency where this may have moved a little bit from where I had it clamped. But I think we'll be okay. We'll get them in and we'll sand it in, get it closer. So now I'm going to glue and screw those. So you can see our little bit of error right there, but I think we'll be fine. I may just pull it out a little bit and let the screw pull it down. But one important thing to know is with slopes like this, set your screws back far enough to where they're not too close to the edge or you're going to get one to protrude or make it want to split, especially with this MDF. If you're using a better plywood, there's less chance of edge splitting, but this MDF, it likes to split on the edge if you get too close to it. I do have a little bit I got to sand here, but I think we'll be okay. Looks fairly even and blended across there. Once again, we're going to use the straight edge. I've come up with a rough dimension for how tall my upper stations need to be. So we're going to use the straight edge and the skill saw and cut them out. So my bottom pieces had a cut of 40 degrees. Just to make it simple, we had a cut of 40 degrees. So that leaves me with 50 degrees. I don't know why it worked out that way. We're going to cut this part of the video out. So this is a drop from one of the angles that I cut for the front stations. And that cut, I took 40 degrees off of it. So when it was in the miter box, it was reading 40 degrees, but it took 40 degrees off and left me with 50 degrees of angle. So the back of our station buck is 90 degrees to the base plate. So that leaves 40 degrees in between that open gap for our upper stations. That works out great because I could take 20 degrees off of each side and the stations will end up fitting in nicely, and I only had to set the miter box up once. So here's a test piece that I did. And as you can see, they fit in there very nicely and it's very simple to cut. So it's important to think about what angles you're using and trying to get things to work out nice and evenly. In this case, it just did right off the gun. So I could set up the miter box one time, cut both sides, and have my blanks ready. So here we have our wedges in place, our upper stations. And I've just come in with the pencil and I've marked how they meet the sweep stations. So I don't have a radius gauge for that. So what I did is I just came over, and it should be consistent all the way through on this part. So I just used the edge of this buck as my station. Sorry, I used the edge of the buck as the radius gauge in order to draw the lines. So now what I'm going to do is the same thing. I'm going to cut it, give it a little bit of sanding, do that to both parts, compare the two parts, and then we'll join them together. Cut right to my pencil line, and then I'll sand the pencil line off. So if this was real plywood, I would pocket jig. I would use a pocket jig to put a pocket right there and put a screw in. But MDF, I haven't had much luck with pocket screws, so I'm just gonna put a good amount of glue and wait for it to set up before I do anything more. We can do a bit of sanding, but we don't want to do anything rough with it when it's like that. So now, we have our number 25 sweep. If you notice here, it's difficult to see on this one, but there is a little bit of gap. This one has a little bit more. Okay, so what we're gonna do is right in the area of this sweep, we're gonna taper it down until it matches the sweep, and then sand and blend this all together. Once we get that blended in, we can then go over it with the sander and we can blend everything together. we'll have a buck to represent that shape. You see, we've got a little bit of blending to do on these corners on the low sides. But we'll get those corners matched up with the sweep. And once they're matched up, we'll start blending everything together. I think it looks pretty good. Now we got something that won't flex that we can compare our sheet metal to and make the front nose of that louver or cowl hood. So I'm doing this as a post operation, but it could easily be done before it's assembled on each part. But I've laid off these offsets and we're going to make holes so that we can observe and see through the buck to what's happening to the panel underneath of it. So we're going to take a hole saw and cut out one corner and then take the jigsaw and cut out the rest. And we'll end up with it being skeletonized like this. And what that'll allow us to do is we can then look up through it and we can see the different stations and how the parts are all coming together. So that's the step that I'm on now. But like I said, it could be done before it's assembled, but I wanted to assemble it, find out where all my screws are and what lengths they were and everything before I did it. So I'm going to get the rest of this cut out. We'll take another look at it. we'll be able to see up into there and see exactly how that sheet metal's sitting on that station, or we'll be able to take a feeler gauge and come in, or shim stock or something, and come in here and feel and just get an idea for what needs to happen. So here we have it with all our little skeletonized sections so that we can see through and be able to tell what needs to happen. We could come in with a hole saw and add some more if we need to, but with this simple buck, I think that would be enough. One thing I am going to do is I'm going to take a piece of welding wire and just go between a couple of stations and bridge them and look for any lows or highs that I might have to need to sand, or if it's a low, I can use a little bit of fiberglass body filler and true it up. But all in all, I think it turned out pretty well. And the buck is going to give us a representation of what our part needs to be in the proper form. And that way we can figure out what shape we need to add to the part to get it into that form.